Good morning, church. My name is Pastor Anne Marie, and we are so excited that you are here with us in worship this morning. There's just a couple of things I want to draw y'all's attention to as we get started this morning. One is, if you look around, you might find some unusual decorations. So we have some milkshakes over here, some photo backdrops in the back. We had our women's retreat this weekend. Unfortunately, we don't have any milkshakes left. I'm really sorry for that. But if you would like to take use of these photo backdrops, I invite you to do that. They were too beautiful to take down after one weekend. If you have something coming up where you're like, I would love a giant milkshake, let me know, please. My friends, this morning, I wonder if you are like me, where you have experienced some great joy this week. We had our women's Bible study, we had our neighborhood table, we had our women's retreat. And I wonder if you are like me and you've experienced great sorrow this week. If you have witnessed the reality of pain and violence and hurt in our world. You know, this morning we were gathered together in our confirmation class, and one of our students asked, well, Anne-Marie, what is heaven like? Which is a great question. And we flipped all the way over to Revelations 21, and we read from the words of John about this vision, where God wipes away every tear from our eye, where there is no death or pain, where God dwells with us, and we are with one another. My friends, we sit in the tension this morning of knowing that our God is with us, that the world God is calling us to is springing forth around us, and yet we are not yet in that world. So the question is, how do we live in this world with the reality that there is a better one coming? How do we live out our faith? So we've been starting this new series just last week. It's called Surprise the World, 5 Habits of Highly Missional People. And the idea is simple. The good news of God's grace is good, it's holy, it's surprising. And as people who want to follow after that God, to share that same message, we are called to share that same good news with others. And the best way we can do so is by living surprising lives, just like Jesus did. And so last week we talked about how the first way we surprise the world with good news is to bless others. And you were challenged to bless a person in our community and a person outside of it. And if you didn't get one in, let me just tell you guys, you being here is a blessing to me, so congratulations, you did it. But this week we have a new habit for us, an easy, simple way that we live out the surprising news of God's grace, that we remind others of the world that is coming, even as we live in the midst of the world that we have now. And of course, to do so is to follow after the pattern of Jesus, the life that he lived. And so I'm going to start us off with a little test this morning. There is not a grade. Take a deep breath. But throughout the Gospels, Jesus is described as the Son of Man who comes to do something specific. There are a couple different instances of this. And so what I'm going to do is start off the phrase, the Son of Man came, this is describing Jesus. How would you fill in the blank? The Son of Man, Jesus, came to do what? I wonder if anything comes to mind. I can hear some of you guys whispering the right answers. You're doing great. Maybe you thought of the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Mark 10:45. Maybe that's what came to your mind. Or maybe it was the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Luke 19, verse 10. Or maybe, if you're a real biblical scholar, you found my favorite one, which is, of course, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. My friends, Luke 7:34. Here's my hypothesis I would like us to test this morning. I think each of these descriptions about Jesus, about his surprising life, are interconnected. That somehow Jesus coming, eating and drinking connects with serving and not being served. It connects with seeking and saving the lost. That actually all of these are part of the same missional habit that we might engage in together as we hope to surprise the world with good news. That's my hypothesis for us this morning, but let's test it together. So we are going to be in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. So last week we noticed the way that Jesus called Peter and James and John into discipleship, and this week discipleship knocks on the door of a wee man named Zacchaeus. So Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem to experience the Passover and his passion. And on the way he passes through Jericho, and this is what happens. Luke 19, beginning in verse 1. It says, he entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd, he could not because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. So I think one of my favorite podcasts, if you are looking for recommendations, comes from a children's pastor named Meredith Miller, and she hosts a podcast called Ask Away. And she goes through different Bible stories with her 2 young sons. And as a children's pastor, she kind of lets the kids take the driver's seat on their Bible study. So they get to ask the questions, they get to point out what's weird or cool or interesting about the story. And my favorite episode comes when they read the story of the calling of the disciple Matthew. So she's talking to them about discipleship and what it means to follow after Jesus, and she asks them kind of a leading question. She says, okay, what do you guys think Jesus says whenever he wants people to join him? And they're kind of like, there's like a tense pause. They don't know what the answer is. And so she gives them a hint. She says, okay, it's a 2-word phrase. It's another pause. You guys kind of know where I'm going. So does the 6-year-old. He pops up and says, I know, dinner time. He's not wrong. Of course, the phrase that she's looking for is follow me, right? But if we look at Jesus' ministry, the reality of the way that he calls people to follow him sounds a lot like dinner time. It's actually what happens in our story. Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. He's passing through Jericho when he encounters Zacchaeus. Now, we learn 2 things about Zacchaeus from the very outset. We learn he's a chief tax collector and that he's rich. Now, both of these are things that would not give you a lot of credibility with the general populace of that time. So we can gather that Zacchaeus has a poor reputation among the people. So if he's a chief tax collector, that means that he is one who exacts a toll or a tax from people. You might think about, a kind of customs. They're in charge of charging for different items passing through Jericho, which is on a trade route. And so, as often was the custom of tax collectors, they earned this negative reputation because they might charge 20 pieces of silver for something that was really worth 10, and they would pocket the rest. That will not earn you favor. And Zacchaeus is a chief tax collector, which means he doesn't necessarily do this work. He's in charge of the people who do it, and when they get a cut, he gets a cut. Y'all with me? And he's rich, right, as we might imagine. So he has this negative reputation with the crowd. And being rich doesn't seem to keep him from acting in an improper manner. He hears that Jesus is coming through town, and what does he do? He runs. He climbs a tree in order to see Jesus pass by. And when Jesus sees him, he calls down and says, "Zacchaeus, I must stay at your house today." Can I just take a quick poll? How many of y'all know the song Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was a wee little. Okay, great. I was going over my message last night, and I was asking my husband Leighton, "Hey, you know this song?" And he was like, "You are so weird." So I'm so glad my people are here. It's great. But he tells Zacchaeus, "I must stay at your house today." And in that culture, not unlike today, who you ate with matters. Because when you share a meal with someone, when you go to their home, which is what it's implied, and Jesus saying, "I must stay at your house today," they're going to have a meal. And when you share a table with someone, you are saying you accept them, that you are in the same kind of status as them, that they are like you, that you belong at the same table. So for Jesus to do this, Jesus is accepting of Zacchaeus enough to give him the kind of grace that involves sitting at the table with him. And so naturally, Zacchaeus is delighted, and how does the crowd respond? They start to grumble. Jesus is often quoted as a friend of tax collectors and sinners. He eats with them, he accepts them, he communes with them. And I think that practice shows us how those first few verses are all related. Our second missional habit, I think, is really good for this church. We surprise the world by eating with others. We share our table. We share our meals. Not just with our family, not just with our friends, but our neighbors. The ones who act like us. The ones who don't. It's how Jesus offers the good news to Zacchaeus. It was several years ago when we were in the heart of the pandemic, and I was taking United Methodist doctrine, which means our theology and our teachings, on Zoom. Not my favorite way to take a class, but we made it. But it was the summer of 2020. We were seeing one another on screens, and I can still remember my professor, one of my favorites, Dr. Rebecca Miles, said that one of the great dangers of our time is that we might make caricatures of one another. That we might make caricatures of one another. That we might start to see people as statistics or ideas or things and not people. And I wonder, as I read this story, if that's how the crowd felt about Zacchaeus. He wasn't a member of their community. He was one harming it. He was no longer a person. He was a thing, a caricature that could not be trusted or welcomed. And I wonder if Zacchaeus felt the same way about them. He doesn't even try to engage with the crowd. He sees Jesus is going to be passing by, and he scales a tree. I wonder who we are in danger of creating caricatures of. If it's our brothers and sisters who are suffering on the other side of the world. I wonder if it's those in our country who are battling ongoing oppression. I wonder if it's those who are on the other side of the political aisle. I wonder where we are being tempted to let people become statistics or ideas or things, caricatures, and not people. Remember, all the way back in the book of Genesis, our God created humanity in God's own image. And I wonder, when we fall into this temptation of creating people into other things that are not people, if we are resisting the image of God that God has placed in them. I know I have. I think the people in our story might. But here's what we know: Jesus doesn't. In the world that we live in today, the practice of making caricatures of other people is not surprising. But resisting it is. Deciding that no matter what, God has decided who is of sacred worth and value, and that it's all of us, each of us, all human people created in God's own image. Resisting that dehumanization wherever it presents itself, my friends, that's surprising. But that's what Jesus does. And I can't help but wonder if that's not what we are called to do. And I think in our text this morning, he shows us the way to do that. He shares his table, a meal. He invites Zacchaeus to eat with him. And my friends, I want us to notice what happens. So I want us to return to our story back in verse 8. Jesus has offered this invitation to Zacchaeus. The crowd has grumbled, and Zacchaeus says in verse 8, Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost." Salvation has come to this house, for this man too is a son of Abraham. Do y'all see how it restores him back to the community? Because he offers an invitation to share a meal. And what I love, as we start to close together, is that this occurs in 2 different ways. As we look at the text, Jesus commits to eating with Zacchaeus, and we see he responds with what appears to be a change of heart. This invitation, this acceptance, this restored common humanity changes him. He commits to giving half of what he owns away, to repay 4 times as much of what anyone would have asked of him. He seems to live out exactly what we read over and over in Scripture, that God gives us love first, and from that love, we can be transformed. That from that communion, that time together, our hearts might be changed. That's one way to read it. The second way I learned about this week, because if you look at the Greek of this text, we find that Zacchaeus speaks in the present tense. So we could read it as, because of what's happened, Zacchaeus says, "I give away half of my possessions." Or in other words, he will now do that. But because it's in the present tense, we can also read it as the crowd has grumbled, Zacchaeus has stood up, and he is sharing with them what he already does in the present tense. I give away half of my possessions. If I defraud anybody, if I have, I will repay them 4 times as much. I do that. It seems as though when we share a table with someone, it can become a way that hearts are changed, or a way that seeing is changed. We might find something different than what we expected. So I have to tell y'all one last story. It was about a year ago, and all my stories that I tell are true, but before I get into this, I just want to say, this is really, really true. They're all true, but I'm serious. It was about a year ago, and I went to go visit a member of our community who was in the hospital. And while I was there, one of their neighbors came to also visit them. And so I was sharing with the neighbor, who I am, what church I'm from. I serve at First United Methodist Church of Colleyville. It's a lovely place. This person is a member of it. What a great community. And this neighbor who had come to visit their friend said, I know that church. Your church is the eatingest church in town. My friends, what a legacy. But I believe that's true, my friends. This church is good at sharing the table. We saw it on Wednesday night as we shared a meal. We saw it this weekend as our women's retreat gathered together. We see it each and every week as our church, our United Methodist Men, goes out into the community and shares lunches and weekend meal bags with kids in our schools. We are good at sharing the table because we know Jesus always meets us there. It's a way that we announce what God is like, a way that we surprise the world, where we can experience changed hearts and changed seeing. And so, my friends, I'm sure it will not surprise you. You have a challenge this week, but don't worry, I think it's a good one. What I hope that you do is in the 21 meals you experience in the next week, that you will take 2 of them and you will share one with a member of our community, and that you will share one with a member outside of our community. That we might share the table and a meal together. And my friends, we know the reality of the world that we live in. We know that sharing 2 meals might not change everything that's wrong in our world. But we know that God calls us together, that we don't fix things in isolation, that God calls us to God's self and to be in communion with one another. So I wonder if we can do just a little bit this week to help make that world, the one we read about in Revelation, come to life. Surprise the world by sharing a meal, and remember that God always meets us there. Amen.